Welcome to our second section of the UF222 course, where we are going to be looking at the dominant trends in American religious life. We're going to start this today by looking at colonial religion and probably exploding some stories and some foundational ideas that we might have that might not actually be accurate. So that way, when we're building the story later on, we know what's happening next and why that is.
Nostalgia. It sure ain't as good as it used to be. Nostalgia is the enemy of history, according to the historian Roger Fink. How has nostalgia affected your stories, the stories of your family? How about also of the country? Many times when we're looking at colonial life or colonial religion, which we're going to shortly, we have this lens of nostalgia that blocks us from seeing things or kind of reinterprets how everything is there. What we're going to work on is actually trying to see things as they are and not just what nostalgia tells us they are. To start with, sorry to burst your bubble, most of our illusions about the country are just illusions. They're just nostalgia. They're just stories we tell because it has some sort of significance. It does resonate with us, and there's value in those stories. But there's also a lot of value in knowing what actually happened and what actually is. To start with, the country was not founded by a bunch of Puritans. Yes, those are a group of people who were amongst the founding of the country, but it was not a wholesale one thing. There were a lot of different parts. There were a lot of different colonies, a lot of different interpretations on what a new world should look like. There was a lot of different people who came over from England as well as elsewhere in Europe, most of which, the vast majority of which, were not Puritans. The fact is that there was never, and there never were, that many Puritans even in New England. And there was a lot of non Puritan behavior all around. From 1761 through 1800, a third, 33.7 to be precise, of all first births in New England occurred after less than 9 months of marriage. Now, that's out of line from what we would expect amongst the Puritans. A third of all first births were done within 9 months. Could it be that there were that many preemies? Maybe that certain percentage of it. But, given everything else, that tells us that some people were pregnant before they got married. Uh, and then they got married to help resolve that issue. In 1776, only about 1 in 5 New Englanders had a religious affiliation. The country is far more religious today than it was in 1776. You should recall the Gallup polls reported that in 2024, 20% of Americans attended church every week, and 41% of Americans are in a monthly church attendance or more. In 1776, only 17% of Americans belonged to a church at all, let alone knowing how often they might attend or what was needed to be in good standing in different communities. Between 1980 and the year 2000, the percentage of Americans who belonged to a church was 62%, a quite an uptick over the founding of this country. The 13 colonies came into being as a result of two great waves of English colonization, which separated about 20 different years. The first is 1640 to 1660, during the time of the English Civil War and the realm of Cromwell. It's kind of that window in between these. Virginia, Maryland, and New England colonies were products of the earlier years, and the later years, those following the Restoration, following 1660, um, included the capture of New Netherlands from the Dutch, later becomes known as New York, the founding of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, South and North Carolina, and finally Georgia as late as 1733. To break down a little bit more and demonstrate that this was not beginning off as a vastly Puritan commonwealth in the entire country, again, we look at New England as the sort of epicenter of that, but outside of that, there's a lot of country. There are, other colonies that are not a part of New England. Um, Most of the Puritans became Congregationalists. And while we see in 1776 there are 668 Congregationalist congregations, what we notice very quickly looking at that list is that by no measure is the majority of the churches that existed at the founding. And if we were to actually tease out their location, the vast majority of those are only found in New England. In 1776, the dominant denominations in the U.S. were the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians, Baptists, Episcopalians, and Quakers in that order. We kind of drop off a ledge at that point, but still, even a good consistency of that. By the way, the Presbyterians, Baptists, Episcopalians, and Quakers have much a wider swath of locations that they're found, not just in New England like the Congregationalists, with a few outposts outside of that. The sort of density of what this looked like varied. Also, by the end of the 19th century, this list is going to look very different. Not only the number of congregations will fluctuate, but also who has the majority and where this is going to go. Additionally, if you're, for instance, Baptist, what a Baptist looked like in 1776 and what a Baptist looked like in the year 1900 is very different. There's a lot of different movements that impact that particular group. So your group might not be here, or it might be rather small, or it might be rather large, and all of that is going to change very quickly. Also in 1776, 42% of the population of the South was made up by slaves. Today, we think of African Americans, the descendants of these slaves, as having a higher church attendance than their white population neighbors. But in 1776, that wasn't the case. The vast majority of slaves did not belong to any church. That is a product, really, of the early colonial, late 18th, early 19th century, and in many ways, kind of leading that in even to the 20th century as well. Also, the most religious colonies were South Carolina at 31%. Now, the total number, if we include the slaves in South Carolina of religious adherents in South Carolina, was only 14%. New Jersey is the next most pious or church-going of the colonies at 26%, followed by Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. The least religious colonies were Vermont at 9%. North Carolina was at 14% of the white population, 9% of the total population. Georgia at 20, and Maryland at 17. So again, the total population, not very high. Even amongst the more church-going whites, it still isn't very high. It's less than a quarter in the vast majority of the colonies. Typically, it's about 17%. While we might think of the Americas and the colonies being founded first by Puritans, actually the first ones here were Anglicans, and that should actually make sense from the English perspective, right? The Anglicans are the first to establish themselves on the American scene, but they were never really the largest nor the most influential of the colonial religious bodies. In Virginia alone was Anglicanism the established religion from the beginning, where it held some notion of supremacy, at least for a period of time. In Virginia, a provision was made to enforce conformity to the Church of England. The instructions of James I in the Charter of Virginia were rather explicit. Quote, "The true word and service of God was to be preached, planted, and used in the new colony, according to the doctrine of rights and religion now professed and established within our realm of England." So we have this as the foundation there in Virginia. To this end, chaplains were appointed by the company, and repeated legislation required everyone to attend services of the church. And again, if you have to legislate it, it means people aren't doing it. And it wasn't very much enforced, so still most people didn't show up. In 1660, religious uniformity of Virginia ended when Quaker missionaries established a community. Also, the Anglicans did not provide much pastoral care, as getting a proper minister was rather difficult. They needed to be trained up in England and sent off. That is a very expensive and time consuming process, and most ministers didn't want to go off into the new land and, quite frankly, face death. Most of them, if they've gone through study and were able to do that, wanted to stay in England. Then also Scots from Northern Ireland and Germans migrated into Virginia, adding Presbyterians and Baptists and others, all here at the end of the 17th, early 18th century. The southern states, North and South Carolina and Georgia, were also officially Anglican, but had religious toleration pretty much from the beginning and were never uniform, and were also much later after the Restoration is when they ended up arriving. The Puritans who founded New England are more properly understood as separatists. We have different separatist and non-separatist waves of Congregationalists who will end up making their way over. But that first wave who showed up were separatists. They were called nonconformists by the English, and that is primarily because they didn't conform to the national church, to Anglicanism, and the Book of Common Prayer wasn't that common to them. They rejected many of the tenets and notions of that prayer and that prayer rule. They were English, but in England they were extremists, and this led them into exile, floggings, imprisonment, and in many cases also death. Some separatists went off to the Netherlands, as there was a greater degree of religious freedom found in the Low Countries, pretty much from its very beginning. But many of them wanted to remain English and not just become Dutch. And so there's a tension that exists there. Don't worry, the English will become Dutch after the Glorious Revolution. Hot take. Other than rejecting the Book of Common Prayer and being very Calvinist, other key identifying factors was the form of ecclesial government that they preferred. They debated as to the proper structure of the church. They thought the New Testament church, as they read it, was congregationalist. In other words, each church was a local small body, a congregation, and not a part of a larger group. Therefore, the tenets and the ideas of what is proper are dictated by this small congregation. They'll vote or interpret how things want to go as one unified body. They usually point to verses that'll talk about the church found in, Galatia, the church found in Ephesus, right? So they're looking at these individual things and saying that this is the proper form of what a church should look like. This is not the structure of the Church of England, which was episcopal. In other words, episcopal means it's dictated by the episcopacy, that is, the bishops. You also see this in the New Testament. Paul writes this to Titus and Timothy. He talks about bishops. Overseers is how a lot of Protestants might translate that same term. But the episcopal office is top down. The churches are all one under a bishop. This is the way historic Christianity is operated in the East and the West. Kind of following the rules of bishops. But for many of the Puritans, there's a problem with that, is that it looks too Catholic. And so they're dismissing it out of hand from that. Another strain of church governance, that which kind of dominated Scotland, is Presbyterian. That is, that it's run by the presbyters. We get the word priest from presbyter. Kind of through a couple of different language iterations, etc. But it's run by the priest. The priest is the head of the local church. and oftentimes the priests will kind of work together, but it's not up to the people of the congregation, it's up to the priest. Again, the term presbyter we find throughout the New Testament as well, and each of these groups, be them Congregationalist, Episcopalian, or Presbyterian, or some derivation thereof, each have their different biblical sources that they'd want to say, this is my justification for this church. And this is how we'd want to do all of that. But the Puritans eventually said, no, we are going to be Congregationalists, which was a bit more of the extreme position here at the founding of the colonies of New England. And they negotiated approval to come to America from the Virginia Company and from King James. James actually thought it was more acceptable to have these religious fanatics thousands of miles away than close at home where they're causing tension. And really, rightfully so, because those who stayed later on will take his son's head, Charles I. And so the farther away with this group of people might have been better. They stated also that they were not radicals or hostile to the nation's interests. In other words, they weren't coming off to the new colonies to completely separate themselves away from England, but rather to be English over there instead of being, for instance, again, Dutch. They also told the company that they were not likely to subvert the colonial enterprise. And this was true for maybe a century. Thus, in July of 1620, a portion of the Leyden Church left Holland, that is the Netherlands, right, for England, where they were ready to cross the Atlantic. They left Plymouth, England, and they went to North Virginia. Right, the entire colonies were under this idea of Virginia for the Virginia Company. Eventually, they landed off of Cape Cod, and the Pilgrims decided that they were done with sea and settled there. Makes sense. The aim of the Puritans in New England was to transform it into a new Geneva, following the model of what Calvin did in the city of Geneva. They're trying to be strict Calvinists at this point, creating a true and pure Christian church. Therefore, to be a citizen, you had to receive communion. To receive communion, you needed to be a member of the church. To be a member of the church, you had to be one of the elect. To be one of the elect, you had to have a conversion experience, an experience that was communicable to others who were already in the church, showing that indeed you belonged there. As a result, even here amongst the Puritans in New England, there were many who were not citizens. They weren't a part of the church. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't properly members of the congregation. And since this is the form of government, they weren't a part of the government. There wasn't this we all get to vote sort of notion wrapped up within any of that. Now, this helps and works early on when everyone is kind of there and landing. But what happens later on? What happens with subsequent generations? This is where the Cambridge Platform of 1648 helps to explain a complicated issue at hand. It dealt with church membership. According, again, to congregational theory, both the believing adult and their infant child belong to the church. The later, known as being federally holy, they're entitled to receive certain benefits, such as baptism. Baptism brings you into the church. Later on, you'll have your conversion experience. You're not receiving communion until after that. Usually, that's an experience that's going to happen or be relayed anywhere between the age of 7 on. Again, it varies individually. You might even be a part of a particular community that you all have conversion experiences, and you understand that varies to a certain point. Baptism is seen here as an initiation into the life of the church, but was not understood as to mean that you were a Christian properly. In addition to baptism, you still needed to have this conversion experience. This is the account of your own repentance and your own faith in order to qualify for the Eucharist, for the Lord's Supper, for communion. True faith, even among the weakest Christians, should be confirmed by some sort of specific experience of God's redeeming grace. Otherwise, you're not one of the elect. You're outside of the realm of grace, and therefore the atonement didn't apply to you, following Calvin's doctrine of limited atonement. As such, reaching this age of discretion, the child is required to give the account of their own repentance. For many, this will take several years, if ever. As such, they would never be allowed to partake of the Lord's Supper or to vote or to be a full member of the community. Without this conversion experience, this person was not admitted to full membership, and they were called halfway members. This is the sort of phrase that people talk about. You're halfway in the church. You are baptized, you are initiated, but you're not all the way in. You don't get to vote, and you don't get to make policy on these decisions. So the real problem came not with the halfway members. We all can kind of follow and understand that, but with the next generation. What should you do if both parents were only halfway members? Were those children federally related to the church and qualified to receive baptism? This is a massive issue, by the way, in New England at this time, right? 1648, that's what they're discussing. They now have arrived at this point where there are grandchildren. Are they connected? Well, what's more important, baptism, right? This beginning stage of grace that's given to infants to allow them the best means of having this conversion experience, or having a pure church. Because if you baptize people who are children not of full members, well, what does that do? Does that water down? And the whole point of New England was to be a new Geneva, to be this shining light on a hill where everyone was purely a part of this church. That is the governance structure of the separatists who made it there. This is a massive tension, and eventually they said that baptism was more important than having a pure church. Again, your children of halfway members, they still weren't going to be able to vote, but they would be at least some degree a part of that body. And this was a process of lowering the bar. The first person to really advocate the bar lowering even farther is a man by the name of Solomon Stoddard, stuttering over Stoddard, who insisted that the germ of grace is latent in all children of the covenant and that it should be nourished by partaking of the Lord's Supper as soon as possible. So what Stoddard is actually doing is saying, hey, we should even give them communion because there's still this germ of faith. There's still this little bit that can be nourished and maybe grown by partaking of the Eucharist. Then William Brattle and William Leverett insisted that all distinctions amongst church members should be discarded entirely, and that even those who could not testify to an experience of grace should be allowed to participate in the government of the church, including the right to vote in the selection of a minister. So the bar got lowered even more from no, but you can kind of be there, show up to church services, hopefully you'll get a conversion experience too. Maybe we should also give you communion too. Maybe this experience isn't as important as we were thinking because maybe you grew up pious instead of impious because your parents were pious and didn't have this massive rebellion. Maybe it's just the air that you breathe and you're not noticing the difference. This, by the way, is where the notion that all men should be allowed to vote kind of existed. It was put into a tract by John Wise and used as an ideological weapon during the American Revolution. New England was founded by two separate colonies, at least initially. We have the Plymouth colony, who came from Plymouth, England, and are those separatist Congregationalists we talked about. Shortly after that, a group of non-separatist Congregationalists from the Massachusetts Bay Colony will end up showing up as well. They are also Congregationalists, and so New England is largely a Congregationalist enclave. Most of the Congregationalists, the vast majority, are found in New England. And New England, the vast majority of the people who were there who belonged to a particular church were Congregationalists. And so it's not improper to say that New England is a Congregationalist sort of enclave. They were also more educated than the rest of the colonies. The Congregationalists, both the separatist and non separatist, believed in education. It was important to teach grammar so that way people can read the scriptures. If every individual member of the church, a part of the congregation, as the basic government exists, then those people need to be learned to be able to make discussions and decisions. And so education from grammar school was very important. This is also what will lead to founding of universities to train up adequate preachers in Harvard and Yale. The Congregationalists also found it easier to get ministers from England earlier on. The Anglicans didn't really want to come. They're a part of the established church in England. That is where they studied, that is where they belong, that's where they feel happy, and going off to the colonies and facing possible death and low religious rates and kind of fighting against the population that exists there just to try to eke out to survive isn't something a lot of Anglicans wanted to do. But for a lot of Congregationalists, not being a part of the established system in England, being separatist or non-separatist, still they believed that church government would be best as a congregation. They were more likely and more willing to go off to New England to have this sort of experiment where hopefully they can be a shining light on a hill. This actually resulted in very measurable numbers. Of the 1,586 ministers who served congregational churches in New England during the colonial period, only 79 were not college graduates. This is not even close to any of the other numbers that exist. It far surpasses anywhere else that we're going to have and other denominational affiliations. New England was also the most English of all of the colonies. Uh, in 1790, a census stated that 82% of New England were English. Pennsylvania, only 35% of the people there were English. New York, that's 52%. Different people will come to the colonies for all sorts of different reasons. We end up getting Germans, we have French, we also have Scotch, Dutch, and Irish who will all make their way over. By the way, even though they might have been part of the UK or the development of the UK as that goes by, the Irish, North Irish, and Scottish were not considered to be English. They're something different. So they weren't in that makeup of the most English that we were going to get in New England. In many ways, New Hampshire is just an extension of Massachusetts Bay Colony, an outgrowth within all of that. And the same could be said about Connecticut, founded by Thomas Hooker. Although Connecticut was more conservative than Massachusetts, they ended up arguing over some of the relation of how the church should be interacting with the lives of the citizenry. The Saybrook Platform of 1708 provided more centralized control of the churches. This was an attempt to bring a little bit more reason and stability to the churches in Connecticut. This was opposed to the Brattle Church and the Massachusetts proposals. The only real outlier of New England is Rhode Island. This is kind of the main rival to congregational hegemony and becomes the sort of source of both Baptists and Quakers in the colonies, in addition to other sources for these as well. Baptists are usually associated with Rhode Island, although they are found in other colonies as well. But Rhode Island, as a small colony, is a refuge for those who were expelled, mainly for reasons of religious descent from Massachusetts Bay, and didn't find themselves at home in Connecticut and didn't want to go off to the south at least not quite yet. The most key figure in the founding of Rhode Island is Roger Williams, although he was only briefly a Baptist and later became what was known as a seeker. Rhode Island is the most Baptist of the colonies, but it wasn't very Baptist. Given that between 57% of its churches were Baptist, and only 20% of Rhode Islanders attended any church at all. So that means only about one person in every 10 in Rhode Island would have been a Baptist. Baptists were initially the largest group in Rhode Island, though they were soon rivaled and then surpassed by the Quakers, who utilized the freedom of the colony as a sort of base to attempt to evangelize other parts of New England. The history of the Baptists is a difficult one, with many competing stories. Some want to claim an origin goes back to the Anabaptists and point to people like Menno Simons or other sort of disparate groups, and others will point to John Smith and his English separatist church in the Netherlands. This is an easier road to take, especially when we're talking about the conversion and settlement of New England. So, as it developed in America, we can say that they are another offshoot of Congregationalists because, in many ways, the numbers as they grew in America were just that, offshoots of Congregationalists who have a sort of Congregationalist piety and form of government as well. They argue that if churches were to become composed of believers only, then baptism should also be restricted to those who are able to give some account of their own faith. This is what separates them from their other Congregationalist brothers, is this belief in what's known as believers' baptism. In other words, we're not going to baptize you at the beginning of your life. We're going to wait until later, until you've already had your conversion experience. So it doesn't become the germ of faith, the expression that's going to allow it to grow and let you have this experience. It's going to be the first action that is done later on after you've already converted. This also, by the way, gets rid of the whole halfway covenant problem, because if you didn't have the experience, you're not baptized, you're not a part of the community. You can kind of show up, but you don't get to vote, you don't get to be a part of the congregation in that way. It did, though, raise more questions, such as what do you do with people who were baptized earlier? Do you baptize them again? This is something that is completely just not allowed throughout the history of Christendom. It's against the law. It's everywhere. So do you do it again? Do you violate the law? Well, you're kind of off in the colonies. You might be able to pull it off. In Europe, this isn't done that well. This is one of the reasons why the Anabaptists were called Anabaptists, that is, rebaptizers. And this is the main reason why they faced persecution by both the Catholics and Protestant sects in Europe. Also, believers' baptism kind of has some other problems that rise up. Like, what do you do about verses in Scripture that say baptism saves? 1 Peter 3, for instance, amongst others. Or in Acts, where it states that whole households were baptized, and that would have included a lot of children who wouldn't have had a conversion experience that was done by the head of the household. And yet, the book of Acts says the whole household was baptized, including these children. And if you're not baptized until after you're saved, then there's another question: what does baptism do? If the answer is nothing, then why do we have to have it? And if you're willing to get rid of one of the remaining two sacraments for most Protestants, then what's left? And what does this then mean to things like the Eucharist? And what does that do? And what is the whole point of church? Kind of start pulling on this thread a little bit more. You might want to say, stop here, don't go any farther, but that's its own challenge, right? This opened the door to a whole host of anti-sacramentalism that will be evident in the next century. But initially, the whole notion of believers' baptism was an expedient resolution to many of the problems that were facing the Congregationalists. And so this becomes the new avenue for Baptists, especially in New England, but as it spreads throughout the colonies as well. Many of the questions posed by congregational piety were answered by Quakers in the affirmative. They allowed for birthright membership. Unlike the Congregationalists, who were fairly confined to New England, the Quakers, like the Baptists and the Anglicans, were found among all of the colonies. By 1776, the Quakers were the fifth largest religious body by congregation, and in many states they were the second or third largest group. Largely, they were pacifists. The Quakers could be identified by their plain dress, plain speech, and plain behavior. They gathered in silence for worship until one of their number would quake and have a word from the Lord. They would be led by the Spirit to speak. Their quaking, that sort of motion, is what gives them the name Quakers, although this wasn't always done. Many of them became itinerant publishers of the truth. They went out and preached throughout all of the colonies or in Europe where they started, moving from place to place to declare that Christ had already indeed returned to reign, and that he was raising up as the Christ within innumerable sons and daughters. That terrible day of the Lord was also at hand. It is indeed the end of the world. They were one of the most significant group of missionaries in the colonies. While generally mild, their missionary activities were anything but. It was customary for many of them to invade a church and to interrupt the sermon with denunciations of false worship and folly of seeking God through empty forms and human interventions. A few of them even felt called by the Spirit to more bizarre behavior, such as going naked through the streets of a town as a sign, much as you would find in Old Testament prophets. They were also one of the groups to face the most severe persecution, not only from their beliefs, but also this interruption that occurred, um, not only in England, but also in the colonies. This persecution followed them here. They faced fines, banishment, and even death for preaching. Peter Stuyvesant, 1592 to 1672, who took over New Amsterdam in 1647, referred to the Quakers as that, quote, abominable heresy, and he worked as hard as he could to stamp it out of New Amsterdam. In 1662, though, he was told that the majority of the citizens in Long Island gathered on Sundays in secret Quaker meetings. In other words, it wasn't working. New England, until 1661, Quaker missionaries were banished, and if they ever returned after banishment, they were subject to the death penalty. So it's not as if the separatist or non-separatist Congregationalists were okay with anyone being there. Religious uniformity was important. Usually the name associated with Quakers in America is William Penn. That the Quakers were able to grow to such a large presence and even to survive really exists, in respects to William Penn, who lived 1644 to 1718. He was born in London as a student at Oxford, and in 1667 he joined the Society of Friends, the proper name for the Quakers, entering an active ministry on their behalf in England. In 1670, Penn wrote a lengthy treatise called The Great Case of Liberty and Conscience, in which he argued against the senseless intrusion of civil power into the tender area of religious conscience, arguing, a great and good God has given us reason, understanding, and judgment to use in matters religious. These instruments, not sheriffs or armies, courts or jails, properly decide the ultimate matter of the soul. Upon the restoration of the throne of Charles II, Charles owed the Penns, really Penn's father, an admiral, a great debt. And so, to settle that debt, William Penn was given the land allotment that became Pennsylvania in 1681. Penn wanted to secure a colony where he could carry out a holy experiment, a society fashioned in accordance with Quaker ideals, away from worldly corruption. A few Swedes, Finns, and Dutch were already there, and a large-scale Quaker immigration set in at once. This also opened the door for Germans and Scotch-Irish, where we get a lot of Presbyterian growth, who become a group that's larger than the Quakers at the founding of the country. Quakers, for the record, made up only the third largest denomination in Pennsylvania, far behind the Presbyterians and the German Reformed. Moreover, Quakers represented less than 5% of Pennsylvanians, if we include church membership and adherence. Other groups that will also swarm to Pennsylvania are the Mennonites and the Amish, who moved primarily into Lancaster County, west of the early Quaker settlements, and later in the 1730s, German Lutherans and German Reformed Calvinists developed farms and churches in the region near Lancaster. In Ephrata, a German group also settled, being known as Seventh-day Baptists, and they took root in 1732. Strong German communities are found in both North Carolina and Georgia, but it is here in Pennsylvania that kind of becomes the door opening to all of the rest of Europe coming in and settling, because all of these dissident groups could find safe haven in the Quaker state, at least identified as such, right? Again, only about 5%. In many ways, Pennsylvania was not the holy experiment that William Penn hoped it to be. Penn once lamented, "Liberty without obedience is confusion, and obedience without liberty is slavery." Pennsylvania had a lot of liberty and very little obedience, and in many ways, this just became chaos and frustration for William Penn, and this holy experiment didn't quite take off as much as they had hoped. Pennsylvania was supposed to be a holy experiment. In reality, it was just a free-for-all. It did serve as a springboard for missionaries and allowed for toleration. The Quakers were actually more common in Delaware and North Carolina than they were in Pennsylvania. The first Quaker state was not actually Pennsylvania. It was New Jersey. While the history of the colonial New Jersey is rather chaotic in its own right, the Duke of York actually sold West New Jersey to two Quakers, John Fenwick and George Billing, in 1674. This was before the founding of Pennsylvania. They did let William Penn also become one of their proprietors. Delaware was also purchased by Penn from the Duke of York in 1682 and was administered jointly with Pennsylvania until it was given its own separate assembly in 1704. In other words, Delaware was just a part of Pennsylvania for most of its history. Religiously, these two colonies largely followed the same path of Pennsylvania, although, again, slightly higher membership here with the total number of Quakers than what we would have actually in Pennsylvania itself. The Maryland colony was founded in 1632 after its charter was approved by King Charles I. It was named Maryland in honor of Henrietta Maria, the queen consort of Charles I. I know for some there's this idea that it's Maryland and that's why it's Catholic or something along those lines. There's no basis in that at all. It's actually named after the king's wife, so kind of makes sense in that respect, right? The colony is also what's known as a proprietary colony. In other words, it's the personal property of a person. That person is Cecil Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore. Lord Baltimore sought a colony as a refuge for English Catholics fleeing anti-Catholic persecution in Europe, primarily in England. But he also wanted it to be an economic success. And so there's a tension that exists for the Lord Baltimore and his new private land of Maryland. He wants to have a safe refuge for Catholics, but also to be able to make some money and to make it economically viable. Otherwise, it's just going to end in disaster and everyone will die. So with these two desires in hand, he loaded up his two ships, the Ark and the Dove and left England in 1633 with about 200 settlers. A good number of these settlers were actually Protestants and not Catholics, although he did stop off to pick up two Jesuit priests, Father Andrew White and Father John Altman, to be able to at least take care of the spiritual needs of the Catholics who did come along. Few Englishmen really wanted to go to America. We have this idea that it's a new land and filled with hope and possibility, and most of us are thinking about the immigration waves of the 19th and 20th century. But in the 17th century, America was a chaos. It was unknown, uncertain, and oftentimes just kind of understood as a place of death, not of new opportunity. And so a lot had to be done to bring people over. And a lot of Catholics thought, I can just go anywhere else and be okay. There's obviously different areas of Lutheran controlled Germany or Sweden to avoid. But hey, I can go off to Ireland with the Catholics there until the English are having issues with them. Or I can go to Spain. I can go, find refuge elsewhere. So going off to America wasn't an easy thing. So a good portion of those that Lord Baltimore brought were Protestant. He even gave instructions that the Catholics on those ships were to preserve unity and peace among all of the passengers, and that there would be no fights over religion on board of his ships, and the Catholics were to be silent upon all occasions of discourse concerning matters of religion. The Catholic religious services were also conducted as privately as possible, so as to not cause great tension on these ships. Many of the English were opposed outright to giving a colony to a Catholic. The argument circulated, though, that banishment from a pleasant, plentiful, and one's own native country into a wilderness among savages and wild beasts was possibly worse than being hanged. They also admitted that this might help subvert any sort of Catholic coup that might try to overthrow Charles. Charles will be overthrown by a coup, but it won't be a Catholic one. It'll be done by Puritans. As the ships arrived and the first Catholic Mass was held in the English colonies took place on St. Clement Island on March of 1634. Headed by the Jesuit Father Andrew White, they began constructing a chapel in the first city of Maryland, St. Mary's City. It was built along the Chesapeake Bay. By the 1640s, Protestants gained control of the colony. Then, in 1646, Lord Baltimore gained control again. It's amazing how he lost control over what was his own land. Shortly thereafter, in 1649, Maryland passed what was known as the Maryland Toleration Act. It is the first law in the New World to guarantee religious freedom for all Trinitarian Christians. Although the toleration largely was there to guarantee the rights of the Catholics, it is the first example we have of religious freedom in the United States. There were not many dissenting groups also who didn't fit into this toleration in the late 17th century. Additionally, Catholics could scarcely prohibit the practice of Episcopalians if they wanted to, the official religion of England, where the monarch was, quote, the supreme governor of the church and all English lands, including the English colonies, including the personal property of Lord Baltimore. Thus, the charter stated that the churches would be, quote, dedicated and consecrated according to the ecclesiastical laws of our kingdom of England. While initially the colony was officially Anglican, with a notable nod to the Catholic presence, by 1677 both Roman Catholics and Anglicans were a minority. Lord Baltimore's report to the Privy Council stated, quote, the greater part of the inhabitants of that province, 3 of 4 at least, do consist of Presbyterians, Independents, Anabaptists, and Quakers, those of the Church of England, as well as those of the Romanish, being the fewest. In 1692, Maryland lost its proprietary status forever. It was now and would remain a royal colony under the control of a very Protestant England. By 1776, Maryland was the most Catholic colony, but it wasn't very Catholic. About 3 people in 100, again, recall only about 17% of the people attended church at all, but only 3% of Maryland were Catholics. While some histories of America like to say that each colony was set up as a little theocracy, what we actually see is that this was not the case. At the time of their founding, most of the colonies already had religious diversity. By 1776, we can see that outside of New England, no denomination had much more than a third of any single group, and that very few people actually attended church. Broadly, 17%, so less than 1 out of 5 people did, with a few maybe pushing that number. Virginia was English and was supposed to follow the religious guidance of England, following all of the conformity that you would expect to find anywhere else in England. Still, only 34% of Virginia belonged to the Church of England. That is, the number of percentage of people who were formally going to church. The greatest number of any colony outside of New England. Maryland was Catholic, but not very Catholic. It allowed for all sorts of Protestants. Only 15% of churchgoers of Maryland were Catholics. 26.5% were Episcopalians. New Amsterdam or New York was initially a Dutch Reform colony, but that only made up about 26.4% of the congregations. Pennsylvania was Quaker, but not very Quaker. Only 15.3% of the churches were the Society of Friends. New Jersey and Delaware were also Quaker, but not really. New Jersey was slightly more than Pennsylvania at 15.5% of the churches and 30% Presbyterian and 18% Baptist. Far more Presbyterians were found in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware than Quakers. Delaware was the most Quaker of any of these at 19.4%, but also had 37% of the people there were Presbyterians, not the religion that it was, quote, founded for. In fact, Presbyterians kind of just showed up en masse in different waves and kind of scattered throughout all of the colonies and ended up making one of the largest groups by religious adherents of any colonial affiliation. In 1776, the Presbyterians had 588 congregations in the colonies, the second largest, more than Baptist, Episcopalians, and Quakers. The southern states were all supposed to be Episcopalian, but the greatest Episcopalian of them was South Carolina at only 22.9% of the congregations. The others being far more Baptist, Presbyterian, and Quaker than Episcopalian. It is only in New England that we see the theocracy narrative played out to any extent. 71% of Massachusetts was Congregationalist. 65% of the congregations in Vermont. 64% in Connecticut. 63% in New Hampshire, and 60% in Maine. Rhode Island, the breakaway to avoid strict Congregationalists, had about 57% being Baptist and 17% being Congregationalist. But again, this is one region of the country that we might say had this theocratic character. And yeah, places like Massachusetts, it's 71%. That's a good number. But again, religious adherence rates is only about 20%. So still, the vast majority of people didn't belong to any church, let alone was it a pure theocratic government. All of the colonies always had a degree of religious diversity and a degree of religious participation. Your standard history of early American religious life typically addresses the Great Awakening and its impact on the religious landscape of America at this time. As a preference, we need to point out that there was no single event that was the Great Awakening. Rather, there were a series of revivals, or awakenings, that began in New Jersey in the mid-1720s, but did not really come into its own until really the 1740s. They were also not all the same type of religious expression, or the same region, or led by the same person. It began as a movement of the Dutch Reformed, then expressions of Presbyterianism, Congregationalism, and ending with an Anglican/Methodist preacher. The fruit of the awakening was also not limited to those denominations, but it included increased interest in the Baptists and Methodists and other local denominations. What seems to be at the root of the revivals is the consequence of Calvin's doctrine of election and the notion of security as a result of earlier experience or being baptized. The revivalists all pointed to that people took their eternal security too easily and did not produce any good works or dedicate themselves to God in any way other than baptism and formally joining a church. Especially this was the case in New England amongst the Congregationalists, where the clergy no longer preached sermons of conviction and rather gave lectures on theology for their homilies. This is why one of the themes of the Great Awakening is the preaching of damnation. It was a return to conviction and a wrestling with the consequences of sin that had seemed to disappear as a result of all of the debates surrounding the Cambridge platform and halfway members and the bar getting lowered and what it means to actually be saved or a part of the community. The man who actually started the Great Awakening, or at least is credited as doing so, is Theodore J. Frelinghuysen, usually titled as the beginner of the great work, or the beginning of the great work in America. He was actually born in Germany near the Dutch border and was ordained to the Dutch Reformed Church and sent to America in 1719 to become the pastor of 4 Dutch Reformed churches in the Raritan Valley of New Jersey. What we should notice too is that he's the pastor of 4 churches, not just one, which meant there was a bit of a clergy crisis, right? You don't have enough ministers for all of the churches. You had to get somebody from Germany/the Netherlands to come to America and then take over 4 different churches. Right? That should tell us something about the availability of this. By the way, this was not a unique issue. This was not just a problem amongst the Dutch Reformed. Many congregations shared pastors with others and would see their priest or pastor once a month or so. Frelinghuysen was a pietist of the Reformed variety. In this case, it meant that he desired an experiential piety for his congregation, to have a personal, meaningful encounter with Christ. Most of the parishioners did not see this as terribly important. They wanted to ensure that they didn't go to hell and that they were good Dutch immigrants to America. Frelinghuysen sought many reforms akin to what other pietists, such as Spener, did in Europe, including adding disciplines surrounding the Eucharist, having small group meetings in people's homes. He was far more evangelicalistic in his preaching than was normative of the day. The result was actually a split. Many people didn't like what he was doing, but little by little, they were attracted to what he was saying, and the revival took off. By 1726, it was at its height and spread to other Dutch communities, and importantly, to other Dutch ministers. Frelinghuysen may have started the awakening, but he was not alone. Roughly at the same time, we have other revivals coming from different circles, Presbyterian ones. Those who are usually kind of seen as bringing this over are the Tenets, and they started in New Jersey. The Tenets were led by their father, William Tennant, and his sons. The Tenets were Presbyterian who were attracted to the Puritan devotional works that were looking at what mattered. And for them, what mattered was a deep and personal faith and not just church admittance. Gilbert Tennant, one of the sons, reports that his brother John had the first revival in 1727, or possibly 1728, when he was serving in Newcastle. From there, another revival took place in Freehold, New Jersey. When John died in 1732, William Jr. and Gilbert continued the preaching. In 1726, Gilbert was in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and brought the Dutch Reformed revival over to the Presbyterian fold. working alongside the Frelinghuyens. Gilbert's preaching echoed Frelinghuysen's critique of presumptuous security based upon church membership. He pointed out that just because you were baptized, catechized, and given full membership of the church, that didn't mean that you were saved. This was a difficult problem for both Calvinist preachers, as Calvin's emphasis that you are saved by grace and not of works could mean that no good works are needed for salvation. That being brought into the church was a sign of grace. Therefore, nothing else was needed or could be done. Worse yet, for many, the idea that you needed to do anything could be a sign of works righteousness and a rejection of God's grace, thereby showing that you are not indeed the elect. So there's this tension that exists. Do I do work because I'm saved? If I do that, am I putting my faith in my work or am I putting my faith in God? And so a lot of people just kind of sat back and wanted to coast on in, as it were. Gilbert and the Frelinghuysen's message was that grace is not merely assent to proper doctrine, but was the transformative power to change the disposition of the soul. To drive the point home, the emphasis to acknowledge sin and the sinful state of one's own soul, the doctrine of total depravity, was the starting point. One needed to realize that they needed God and that grace was accepting God's forgiveness, not just being right in doctrine. By the end of the 1720s, the work was paying off, and the Presbyterian revival spread from New Brunswick to Staten Island. Over the next decade, there were another 8 to 10 local revivals, and Gilbert's sermons were read in New York and in Boston. The name that many of us have attached with the Great Awakening is Jonathan Edwards. He was actually the third major figure of the Great Awakening. He graduated from Yale in 1720, then he served as a tutor until 1727, where he went off to assist his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, in Northampton, Massachusetts. Edward was shocked here when he showed up at the licentiousness of the youth in town. Many of them, he says, were very much addicted to night walking and frequenting the tavern and lewd practices. It was their manner very frequently to get together in conventions of both sexes for mirth and jollity, which they called frolics, and they would be often spend the greater part of the night in them. To combat this behavior, Edwards met with the young people in their homes. Surprisingly, they responded positively to his meetings. In 1733, Edwards reports that he had grown observably more decent in their attendance of public worship. In other words, just telling them they needed to repent or act better, they started to. The other foe for the staunch Calvinist was the spread of Arminian principles. That is, that human agency could lead to justification. To combat this, in 1734, Jonathan Edwards began to preach 5 sermons on justification by faith alone. Edwards' preaching style was very intentional in producing not only intellectual assent to some theological principles, but in elucidating an emotional response. This sparked a revival, and he was invited to preach in other churches. And by 1736, the revival had spread throughout the Connecticut Valley. The reports of these revivals spread on both sides of the Atlantic, and John Wesley and George Whitefield read both of them. In many ways, Edwards' revivals were similar to that done by the Tennants and Frelinghuyens, although again, now a Congregationalist idea. The notion of presumptuous security is wrapped up within his argument by justification by faith alone. The idea is, okay, well, what does this faith mean? And just like the Tennants and Frelinghuysen, the argument is that grace is not just an assent to doctrine, but is transformative. And that means faith has effects. So you need to kind of live it out. Your life should model what it is that you say you believe. The Great Awakening culminated with the preaching of George Whitefield, the Anglican called the Grand Itinerant. Whitefield was a member of the Wesley's Holiness Club in Oxford, and his life is intimately connected with the development of Methodism both in England and America, although that history is a little complicated and we're not going to get into it here. Like Edwards, Whitefield was a great preacher. Like Wesley, Whitefield preached wherever he could, including outdoors and to great effect. It was even said that by him merely pronouncing the word Mesopotamia, he could bring tears to the eyes of his listeners. Benjamin Franklin became his publisher and actually tested how impressive Whitefield's preaching voice was on several occasions, testifying that Whitefield could preach to thousands and all could hear his booming voice. In England, the avowed skeptic David Hume even stated that Whitefield was, quote, the most ingenious preacher I ever heard. It is worthwhile to go 20 miles to hear him. Whitefield's preaching was similar to Edwards in that his goal was to move his audience to an emotional act of repentance. He would thunder out to the thousands gathered around him, "Are you saved?" and then go on to explain why the answer was actually no. Like Edwards, he wanted to convict the people of their sins. He also criticized the clergy in America for not caring for their flocks. Quote, I am persuaded the generality of preachers talk of an unknown and unfelt Christ. The reason why congregations have been so dead is because the dead men preach to them. Whitefield owned land in Georgia and went to Philadelphia in 1739. It was here that he met William Tennant, who persuaded him to preach his evangelical message between Philadelphia and New York, adding to the already ongoing revivals. Whitefield agreed and went beyond this request, preaching his way down to Georgia by land and returning to Philadelphia again, and began preaching in New England the following fall of 1740. It was his 1740 campaign that the awakening became an American phenomenon. Whitefield had become quite the spectacle. People came to hear his preaching, and his prowess was announced. The arrival was there in newspapers and including advertisements to come and hear him, advertising also his own books and tracts about the preacher. Over 73 days, he ended up traveling 800 miles and preached 130 sermons. He spoke at Harvard and Yale and met with Edwards before traveling through New York, New Jersey, and Philadelphia. Whitefield traveled back and forth from America and England. He made a total of 7 trips between 1738 and his death in 1770 between England and America, preaching sermons throughout all of this time in Massachusetts and Georgia. A story was later told of him that when he was asked the role of good works might play upon him on the day that he met his Maker, he replied that he would trust in them as one might climb to the moon, trusting a rope of sand. His sufficiency was in Christ alone. Whitefield owned land in Georgia, where he also set up an orphanage and used a lot of the revenue that he raised by his circuit preaching to fund this orphanage. The orphanage largely took care of slaves and others. He was also notably pro-slavery, though, not understanding how the South could actually function without slaves. He did chastise many slave owners for treating his slaves cruelly and for not sharing the gospel with them. For him, this was the great sin, not slavery itself. Whitefield was actually one of the very first to preach to slaves, wanting their eternal salvation, even though he couldn't see how to free them from their earthly bondage. It's important to note that not everyone in America supported the Great Awakening. There were many establishment figures who opposed it. Whitefield preached outside in many cases because he was not permitted to preach inside. In 1741, Gilbert Tennant's sermon, The Danger of an Unconverted Ministry, caused quite a scandal amongst the Presbyterians as he chided many of the Pharisee teachers for denouncing his father. He called them blind teachers and urged people to leave those congregations that were led by unconverted ministers. Charles Chaucer, in turn, called Tennant's preaching unlearned, confused, ill prepared, and ill delivered. Might have been the last part that stung the most. The revivalist groups were then expelled from the synods of Philadelphia and then formed their own new synod in New York, creating a major split, 27 ministers against 22. Again, this is important for Presbyterians. It is the ministers who determine the government. So the total number of ministers who move one way or the other is, the whole issue within the congregation and denomination as it's formed. The rift also took 17 years to heal, but at this point, the revivalists grew and dominated the Presbyterians. Other revivalists joined in the fervor, including the grandson of the founder of Yale, James Davenport, whose highly emotional caused people to cry out and weep and sob and faint and swoon. Anticipating many Pentecostal acts at that time, the revivalists themselves tried to stamp this out. It was seen as an excess, not the pouring out of the Spirit. In New England, the result of the feud splintered, and the Congregationalists ended up going into three different camps. Those anti-revivalists followed Chaucer were called the Old Lights. They tended to be more rationalists than the sort of group that'll follow after them. The Old Lights will develop into the Unitarians by great measure. Another third of the group were the New Lights, as one would imagine, and they supported the revival, but not the unfortunate excesses of Davenport. Some were more okay with the excess, at least some of the emotional manifestations, as evidence of conversion and lay preaching. The final third were largely uncommitted and would just kind of go along with whatever congregation existed there. While all of the revivalists emphasized personal conversion, lax membership, and practices, these all continued. And the whole issue of the halfway covenant advanced by the Cambridge platform was still challenging people unsure as to what church governance should look like, nor membership. Discipline was still a question. The more strict group was still found in Connecticut. At least 98 churches left and formed a separate or strict Congregationalist group. Before too long, this group left the Congregationalist fold entirely and became what was known as separate Baptist. This spread outside of New England into Philadelphia and Virginia, where they mixed with other Baptists, creating a new problem of integration. There are a number of other consequences that this period of revival and anti-revival ended up posing. While Whitefield never formally joined the Methodists, he is accredited as one of the founders, and many of his followers actually did become Methodists. So what does this do to Anglicanism? Is it different in America? We get the split between Northern and Southern over the slavery issue within Methodism as well as Baptists and other denominations. On the positive side of the Great Awakening, it was great because it was general. It became an American phenomenon. Historian Winthrop Hudson maintains that it reinforced the conviction that God had a special destiny in store for America. The awakening contributed greatly to the development of a cohesiveness among the American people. From New England down to Georgia, we have preaching and so a sort of cohesive narrative that existed. Before there was Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, and Adams, a cohesive America was understood through the preachings of Whitefield, Tennant, and Edwards. The result of the Great Awakening was a sense of unity among the colonies, a sense of unity and sacred destiny, among other things, that led to the Revolution. It did not just lead to an explosion of church attendance. Again, recall that in 1776, the total church attendance was still only 17%. By all estimates, twice that number of colonials fervently opposed the revolution. Right? About a third of Americans didn't want to have a revolution, but the idea of what it was to be an American started to be formed, at least in part, as an aftermath of the Great Awakening. So, in conclusion, it'd be good for you to reflect on the legend of colonial religious life in America and how that looks rather different than what the facts actually support on the ground. It was not a golden age where everyone was extremely pious. That era never existed. How have your presuppositions shaped how you approach this period of American history? Should be worth you reflecting upon, as well as what does it mean when your presuppositions are challenged in general and how you adjust. How important is it for you to know what actually happened versus what is a legend and how this shapes your identity?